Welcome everyone to our first Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct webinar. My name is Troy Lee, ABCFP Manager of Member Competence Engagement, and I will be your host today. I am hosting today from Prince George in the unceded traditional territory of the Lheidli First Nation. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to highlight some features that you can access on your webinar desktop. All participants should see the title slide of the presentation in the center of your screen. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with the chat, raise hands, and question and answer icons. You can use the chat box to communicate with me or other participants at any time. Please don't use the chat box for questions. If you have questions for the presenter, simply add them to the question and answer box, and they will be answered when appropriate. You can also upvote other questions that you like. Once the webinar begins, you'll hear and or see the presenter as they progress through their presentation and slides. The microphone and video for all participants will be disabled throughout the webinar. This presentation will be approximately 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of question and answers. Again, you can type your questions in the question and answer box at any time. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and uploaded along with the PowerPoint slides to the ABCFP registrants only continual professional development web pages within a week. We also will be sending out a short survey a few days after the webinar to get some more detailed feedback from you. Today, we'll begin a conversation about the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct. I've provided a hot link in the chat box to our governance page. If you navigate to this page, you can download the code to use as a reference throughout this webinar and in your daily practice. Our presenter today is Mike Larock, RPF, Director of Professional Practice and Forest Stewardship. To start things off, we're going to run a quick poll to get a better sense of who is in attendance today. So you'll see the poll on your screen, just fill it out, and we'll see the results live. Okay, looks like we got mainly RPFs, bit of RFTs, trainees, and some others. Pretty good mix of government, licensee, consulting, and others. And it looks like most attendees have a fair knowledge about the Professional Governance Act and the new PGA bylaws. Mike, do you want to make some comments about that?
Thanks, Troy. That sounds good. It sounds like we have a good mix. I think we can get going.
Okay, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Troy. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Larock, Professional Forester, Director of Professional Practice and Forest Stewardship with the ABCFP. I'm speaking to you today on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. I'm honored to live and work on this land, and I'm thankful to the Comox people who protected and continue to defend the waterways and the forested land. And I try to reflect this land ethic in my own professional practice. It's something we can consider when we talk about professional service and ethical responsibilities in these webinars. Also behind the scenes and helping today and over the next few weeks is Paul Nuttall, RPF, the Deputy Director of Forest Stewardship and Engagement with the ABCFP, and our technical support and administrative assistant is Sinead Coffey. I first met Dr. Lloyd Erland in Salt Lake City several years ago at a joint conference of the CIF and the Society of American Foresters. I've used his book a few times, Ethics in Forestry, and in 2002, when we started on the journey of recognizing the relationship between professional accountability and professional reliance, in particular, is when it was useful to have his reflections. Lloyd writes an introduction to the book, and it's called Developing Ethical Reflection. He talks about it being a specialized skill for habits and ethical thinking, something you have to keep at throughout your entire career. And that's why I picked out this quote in that introduction. He says, ethical wisdom is a journey and not a destination. So that's what we're planning to speak about with the new code. If you were like me, professional ethics are a skill that you'll have to use often. It's an awareness that you need to cultivate throughout your career. I think professional ethics are important because, well, the profession exists in the regulated manner that it is in BC because there is a direct public benefit. If ever we lose that public benefit, then we will also lose the rights that we have as a profession in a regulated practice. The ethics that we have selected in the new code, they contain certain behaviors, specific behaviors. They're intended to prevent a professional from error or inappropriately engaging in conduct that is not appropriate for the circumstance, or specifically in forestry, because the profession exists to serve the public, they need a trusted and respected source of information about the science and the application of the science in forestry. The profession has existed now for more than 75 years because forests are important to the people of BC. With that, here's our plan for the hour or the next 45 minutes. I'll cover the schedule of webinars that's occurring in the coming weeks. We need to cover some background because in order to talk about the new code, there are some changes in terminology. There's also some new terminology. And I plan to introduce the first 4 standards of the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct. We'll beginning to talk about it, just refer to it as the code. As we go through the code, I'll try to highlight for you what's new and how it might affect your practice. Because it's still evolving, there are many things that we'll learn over the coming year, and we'll try and keep you posted on those. At the end, like Troy mentioned, we'll have some questions. So here's our schedule of webinars. It looks complicated, but the timeline is really consistent. Every Wednesday, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And there's 3 components. The code components are introduction to our code, which is today and on June 16th. You can see there in red. Each of those is followed by something we've called office hours. This is a chance in the week following the code to ask questions, provide some comments, and we'll do our best to engage you in conversation and provide some answers. It'll be more of an open forum rather than a presentation. Depending on how we are able to fill those times in the office hours, I might introduce some aspect of change in addition that we wouldn't have talked about in the code or any of the other bylaws. It could be the progress on new committees, what it means to have committees in this new professional governance regime in stewardship and practice. There's also a couple of webinars on of the other bylaws, the cluster of other bylaws. For example, 528 in the registration, certification, and trainees, the use of signature and seal. And then our new continuing professional development program and audits and practice reviews. Here's a few other resources that we've been putting together on the obligations in the code. We've had, over the last year and a bit, we've had a few articles in the BC Forest Professional. Check those out. They're not short term. They have some enduring quality as we learn about the code in the coming year. The increment also, from time to time, updates you on the transition progress. That's the transition from the Foresters Act to the Professional Governance Act. We're producing an e-course on the code in particular. That should be coming in June, timed right at the end of the second webinar on June 16th. We have some interpretive guidelines that are up there on the website now, and guidelines and bulletins and advisories that we're working on. So now for some background information. Something about the origin and the terminology that's associated with the PGA. We started working on this new act, with the government and the other professional regulators as a professional governance framework in about 2017. The Professional Governance Act finally came into play on February 5th, 2021, right after our AGM, during the conference, in fact. You'll hear a lot about the acronym PGA, and that's the Professional Governance Act. It grants self-regulation rights to the profession of forestry and establishes the ABCFP as a regulator of the registrants. It has reserve practice and titles the same as we had under the Foresters Act. However, they're structured a little bit differently. We'll talk a bit about that structure when we talk about the Forest Professionals Regulation. That's new. And also this concept of protective purpose. We will also have a regulated practice of forestry. And let me show you a schematic that helps to place these things in perspective. I'll start with the reserve practice. The reserve practice, sorry about that. The reserve practice is the definition of our previous practice of professional forestry. So when you think of reserve practice, it is that thing around the practice of forestry that you've always known, that we studied, that we learned, that we have contemplated. That is that inner circle reserve forestry practice. And it's established and will be established for other professions based on the concept of protective purpose. Protective purpose means for the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And that includes protection of the environment and health and safety in the workplace. So in other words, if the reservation of professional practice for a particular group doesn't meet protective purpose, then there is no social benefit to having a protective purpose, to having that reserve practice. So reserve practice can only be done by an RPF or an RFT or someone with limited license capability. And another aspect is that those regulated practices outside of forestry, like applied biology and agrology, include in their definition of regulated practice to exclude the reserve practice of forestry. So we have some definition around the road and the curbs and how we operate on that road. The regulated forestry practice is a relatively new concept compared to what we've had before. Regulated practice, you'll notice, is a bigger circle. And it is any advice or services that occur with respect to trees, forests, forest lands, forest resources, forest transportation systems, or forest ecosystems. So that will be referred to in the future as the practice of professional forestry. So the practice of professional forestry is a much bigger scope, and it can include anything. We might have 2 or 3 professions that operate with the same kinds of tasks in the regulated practice of forestry, but you will see a forest professionals reserved practice in that smaller darker green circle. And that reserve practice is the definition of the practice of forestry as we've come to know it over the last 75 years. So with respect to practice rights, we've introduced the PGA, the Forest Professional Regulation, really quickly, and then there's also the ABCFP bylaws. And the group of them is intended to be read as one entity. And there is a hierarchy, right? So we're talking about the Professional Governance Act. Seated underneath that is the Forest Professional Regulation, and then there's direction to the ABCFP, which I'll cover in a moment, and all the ABCFP bylaws that sit under that. It's an opportunity for us to provide some clarity when we put in these bylaws. So you'll see that the practice of professional forestry also is contained in the definitions in our bylaws. Right in the very beginning, you'll see there's a definition of the practice of professional forestry. And we say that it has the same meaning as Section 1 in the Forest Professionals Regulation. And for greater certainty includes the provision of services of managing, advising on, performing or directing work, services, or undertakings respecting trees, forests, forest lands, forest resources, forest ecosystems, or forest transportation systems in a natural or managed, rural or urban environment, and any related incidental or ancillary services or activities. And it includes the promotion and implementation of the principles of stewardship. So in this definition section in the bylaws, you'll notice it's slightly different, and it's meant for clarification. It includes some of the words and pieces that we saw in the previous definition of the practice of professional forestry under the Foresters Act. So some of those words are the same. And some of the important clarifications that are aimed at here is we wanted to give some examples of what is meant by advice or services in the Forest Professionals Regulation. Also, the scope of forest lands in a natural or managed systems, rural or urban, covers the scope of practice of forestry. In addition, we included the principles of stewardship. And we did this in concert with the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance that's approved our bylaws. At the same time that the PGA was established, the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance was also created. And the other acronym you're going to hear quite a bit is the OSPG, the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance. The profession now sits under the Ministry of Attorney General, and the profession is overseen by the OSPG, the office. And there's nothing, while this is new, it will not affect your practice directly. You will see the association become more involved, and it will affect the corporate entity of what we know as the ABCFP. But as trickle down to you, there's indirect implications. But there's also some direct ones, and I hope over the next 8 weeks that we will actually cover all of them. The OSPG audits the ABCFP against 20 regulatory performance standards. These are standards of good professional regulation. You can find those on the OSPG website. Very easy, just in Google, type the Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance, and bang, you're there. The PGA authorized EGBC to regulate firms beginning July of this year. The ABCFP sits on a committee that's working to transition this into forestry. We don't have a firm timeline. It has to be made for forestry and benefit employers and professionals. EGBC has done this for the last several years as on a voluntary basis and has found it to be a win-win. There's also declarations of competence and conflict of interest in Section 60. Those aren't turned on yet and not brought into force, so therefore it won't affect my practice, but I might be referring to it here over the course of the discussion about the code. So this is what the ABCFP must do as a regulator. Protect the public interest by, we have to govern the profession, we have to regulate the practice of professional forestry. Remember, that's the bigger circle. And we have to regulate the registrants, both within the reserve practice and the regulated practice. So how successful we are at this still rides on the shoulders of every one of us. Every registrant carries a load of what the profession is doing. What has changed is what you will see from the ABCFP. the practice of forestry, as you have delivered it, is still the practice of forestry. We have a new regulated practice of forestry that's broader and more encompassing. We're told in this section 22, our responsibilities as a collective is we must superintend the regulated practice. So we have to oversee practice. We have to do a number of things around reserve titles and conditions for registration. But two things I wanted to point out that are in that section 22 is we have to establish, monitor, and enforce standards of practice and standards of professional ethics. And we have to create a continuing competency program. So you'll hear more about that in webinar 6. What's missing from the ABCFP mandate that you used to know? And when I think about the mandate, I think about the Foresters Act. The no longer directly in the Foresters Act is stewardship of forests. Promote good forest stewardship doesn't exist there. The attempt to establish a land ethic mandate is explicitly gone out of the PGA. However, it is still present in the order of act, regulation, bylaws when we look at our bylaws and understanding the regulated practice of professional forestry. Stewardship responsibilities are how you do your practice and how you choose to advocate as an individual forest professional. There's more on this in particular in webinar 4. Practice standards and other requirements in the bylaws no longer are approved by registrants. However, registrants will still play an important part in superintending the practice. And I hope to cover that when we have time in one of our office hours. Association-like things, awards, promotion of the profession are not necessarily through the lens of regulation. That's not what a regulator would do. However, because it is used for professional development and encourages professional behavior, we're going to continue to do those kinds of things with the Office of the Superintendent. So the story on our journey with the PGA begins with the end of the Foresters Act, and it's a story of the code. When we realized we had to build a new code, we had the words of the PGA in the bill. We began to work on parts that were required, and that includes we must have a code of ethics. It's set out in section 57 what we're required to have in that code of ethics. One of our principles was we wanted to have as little change as possible. There's a lot of change in the PGA, and one of the things we didn't have to do was change what we already had and what ABCF members had already voted on. So we started with bylaw 11, which is our code of ethics at the time, and 12, which was the standards of professional practice. And we all voted on the content of those things. We combined those with the 12 ethical principles that exist in the PGA, section 57. And we used the required law together with the contents of the standards and ethics to build the new code. Unlike the last code of ethics, this code, the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct, is not a bylaw unto itself. The new code is Schedule A of Bylaw 9. So check out Bylaw 9 on the website. It sets up the standards of ethical and professional conduct as opposed to the code. The standards so far, there's 3 there. 9.1 summarizes what registrants must follow in terms of standards of competence that exists in Code Standard 1, and ethical standards in Code Standards 2 to 9. 9-2 requires registrants to comply with specific standards of practice and standards of competence that are included in guidelines. So the ABCFP and us who are working there with the volunteers who participate on some of our panels will be going through the process of updating those to the PGA, including identifying specific standards of practice and specific standards of competence. So in future guidelines, you will see, probably bolded, this is a standard of practice. And it's something that we will achieve. Also, a departure from the standard, what exists in standard 9-2 is still the departure from a standard for a particular reason. So it's the same as we've had before. You have to identify the reason, specifically document that reason, and then have a written rationale as to why you're varying from a particular standard, whether it's competence or practice. Also required in is 9-3. That's a practice advisory program. We have had a practice advisory program for almost 15 years now, first run by a committee and then managed by staff over the last several years. Schedule A itself is the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct. That governs the behavior and the way we engage in regulated practice. You notice there's that word regulated practice, that's the bigger circle. Reserve plus any other areas where there is work in forest lands, forest resources. And then the companion document that I referred to, the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct Guidelines for Interpretation, it's available now on the website. There's a couple appendices that are missing because we're still working on those, but we'll be updating those as we close in on the summer here. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the structure of the code. It contains 9 standards. There's standards and objects. The first 4 standards are generally considered to be the foundation of professional service. They are competence, independence, conflict of interest, due diligence. Sort of those core things you often see regardless of the profession. Each standard is actually a statement. So it's not just competence. There's a statement around competence, and that's the standard. Under each standard are objects. We refer to these as benchmarks of performance within a standard. It's important to know that these objects, they don't cover everything to do with what is the standard. They don't represent the fullness of the requirements of the standard. In other words, you can meet the benchmarks, every benchmark underneath a standard, and still fail the standard. The objects are there because they were either parts of the previous code of ethics or standards of practice that we all voted on, or they're requirements in the PGA that we must have. One valuable part of the interpretive guidelines is, I find, is that there's a footnote on each one of these objects as to where the origin of the object is. The objects also come in different types. Sometimes they're explicit, for example, clearly identify each registrant who's contributed to professional work. That is a direction to us, very specific direction. It's standard 2C. In that example, there's a clear distinction between including or omitting a specific professional work. They might also be a pervading quality. So obtain a clear understanding of the objectives of the land and resource use. That's in standard 6A. In that example, the object is only observable in the result of professional work. And then the third type of object you'll come across are aspirational. Inspire confidence in the profession by maintaining high standards in daily conduct and work. That's standard 5A. In this example, the object is apparent in your behavior as a professional. There'll be some more useful, some will be useful for complaints, specifically those ones that are directive, and others are more fitted to supporting professional improvement. So I just covered my background, but I want to check in with Troy. Troy, do we have any questions so far that have cropped up or comments?
Yeah, we got a couple questions here, Mike. The top question is, how does working for, this is from Lori, how does working for a regulated firm affect that firm's employees? Is being a professional different if you're in or not in a regulated firm?
Being a professional is not different if you're in a regulated firm or an unregulated firm. It is the same professional responsibility. What the engineers have found, EGBC has found, and bear in mind, it'll have to be a made in forestry kind of solution. They found that the professional now has a partner who is vested in the very same things that they're required to do. So rather than being something that you as a professional do and I don't pay attention to as the employer, now I have a vested interest. There may be some monetary benefit. There may be benefit that we're out of the pool of audits. there's a number of benefits to some of the employers in the GBC program that make it so that the employer actually comes to the professional and says, hey, I have a note here that says that you haven't met your CPD. Does that mean our certification is at risk? So there's a partnership in how you engage in professional development, select those things that are a benefit to you as a professional, as well as to the direction and objects of the employer.
Thanks, Mike. The next question, pretty popular one. So regulated practice would be, say, a district manager who is not an RFT or RPF?
Regulated practice, I guess the short answer to that is yes. Regulated practice is advice or direction around trees, forest lands, forest resources, forest ecosystems, forest transportation systems. And but also the district manager, the reason why I'm hesitating a bit is there's a statutory obligation there that goes beyond what is professional work. So that's probably an outside example, but a relevant example. The other example are, we used to have technical occupations related to the practice of forestry. Now those are in the regulated practice of forestry. So you'll find cruising, silviculture surveys, those things are within the practice. A lot of the policy work, the other environmental work will also fall within the regulated practice of forestry. We may see that it's also a part of the regulated practice of applied biology. So there will be some overlap in the regulated practice.
Great, thanks, Mike. The next question is a really good one. Sorry, just skipped. If I'm providing free verbal advice on a volunteer basis with the proviso that I state that this is my personal opinion and not a professional opinion regarding a forest-related topic, does the PGA apply?
Yes, the PGA applies. So it applies because you're a professional regulated in one of the professions under the PGA, and it applies to your professional practice and conduct. So you'll see those two things combined. A free verbal advice, I mean, it's hard to imagine, some commentary over the fence between you and your neighbor, or is it something urgent? There's a fire or some sort of environmental tragedy that's happening, and you're required to become involved because of your knowledge. It's always good. I heard what I heard in the question was the professional state that here's my advice, and here's some parameters to that advice. I may be not qualified in this area. I'm giving it to you quickly. It's something that I'm not particularly sure of, but here's my initial thoughts. So I like that qualifying aspect of the question.
Thanks, Mike. The next question from Aaron is, can you clarify the difference between regulated practice and reserve practice, i.e. the role differences between the inner and outer circles?
The role, well, reserve practice is reserved exclusively for registrants of the ABCFP. In fact, in order to engage in the practice of forestry, and for a quick reference, go to our previous definition under the Foresters Act, and that is the reserve practice. If you're engaged in that and you're not a registrant with the ABCFP, then we'll be asking you to cease and desist. And we'll have a partner in that endeavor with the Office of the Superintendent and the other professions. We've already pursued a couple of those kinds of scenarios. The role then of reserve practice is specifically the practice of forestry as we used to know it. We just call it reserve practice. And there you would expect to see an RPF or an RFT who's operating within their scope.
Great. There's a couple more questions, but they're going to apply more to what you're going to say next. So,
okay, Troy, I just wanted to point out that the CPD help at ABCFP is up there, the email, that if you want to leave a question or comment there, it goes to all of us and we manage that. And we'll make sure it gets to the appropriate staff person, get an answer. Okay, onward. Standard 1, competence. Registrants maintain sufficient knowledge, skill, and ability in order to address the matter in question, and must. And there's some objects under there. Practice, and only those practice areas where you're competent, maintain your competence in your specific area of practice, and be accurate when you identify what your qualifications are. The competence standard is one of the more important focal points of the PGA. Here there was a concern from the public and legislators around what forest professionals were doing, around what engineering professionals were doing. So they made it an ethical requirement in that section 57. It also shows up as a statutory requirement. In other words, a direct line between the law and the Ministry of Attorney General and me as a practitioner, or you as a practitioner. That section 60, like I mentioned earlier, is not turned on yet. But within our ethical standards, the evidentiary requirements that we see for competence exists in our new continuing professional development program, which we'll cover at a later webinar. The competence is our specific ability to complete a task or work. Do you have the ability? Professionals in society only engage when they know how to address the circumstance. And sometimes they will have to pull back and say, this is now approaching the limits of my expertise. In recent years, our registrars received complaints, and in professional practice, I've received incidents where professional competence was either the main issue or a contributing factor to failure. In general, the failures break down into two forms. One is intentionally we push the limits of our abilities, and the circumstance is either beyond or moves beyond our abilities, and we're not able to undertake the task properly. We also have the ability at one point, however, the science or the area of practice has moved beyond our abilities. This often happens without an intention. So there's two important questions to focus on with respect to your competence. Do I have the knowledge, skill, and ability to complete the matter at hand? I should always be asking that whenever I undertake work. And does this level of knowledge, skill, and ability meet the expectation of my peers and the requirements of my profession? That's the one that prevents you from unintentionally wandering outside what you used to have as your competence, but now it's no longer. So you also always have to stay in contact with your peers, and from time to time, we provide boundaries of the requirements of those practice areas. So the jingle I like is get competent and stay competent. I hear Troy say that quite a bit. And we've devoted a webinar to the new obligations under CPD. It's webinar 6 on July 7th. Troy will cover the new continuing professional development program, and Paul will cover the audit and practice review program. Those are bylaw 10 and 11 respectively. There's the little picture up here is a policies and procedures guide that's available now on our website under registrant and then competence and professional development. Look there. There's also some declared areas of practice. There's 36 of them in the practice of professional forestry. You'll see those, you would have seen those when you signed renewed this last year. And of course, it'll be mandatory to select 3 in December 1st when we renew this year. There's a new online CPD tracking tool, pretty cool to be able to keep track and log those hours. Really, I mentioned a transition earlier. We have 1 year to come in compliance with the PGA. That's when I say we, I mean the corporate entity of the ABCFP, but a lot of these things rest on your shoulders too. And so your first report for CPD tracking is due November 30th, 2022. But Troy's going to cover all that again. There's a lot of dates and numbers there. He goes through it pretty well. Stay tuned for that. The second standard is independence. Registrants exhibit objectivity and are professionally independent in fact and appearance, and they must. There's 5 objects under independence. A public interest and professional principles come first. We've always had that. It was formerly in the Code of Ethics 11.3.2. When you deliver a professional opinion, then you have to distinguish between what is fact, assumption, and opinion. You notice I have new beside that. And one of our previous questions asked about professional opinion. You know, my free verbal advice when I'm giving a professional opinion. But a professional opinion will now have a definition. And we're told through the PGA that we must distinguish between a fact assumption and an opinion when providing a professional opinion. In order to meet that, we needed some metes and bounds. So you'll see in the guidelines for interpretation a definition for professional opinion. We also have to identify the line of professional work and accountability by identifying each registrant. This is also new. And we'll need to work on some guidance for that in the future. How far do you go? You know, but really by identifying each registrant will mean, is there some accountability there? Is it a mechanism I have to pay attention to? Is there an expertise that's there? But we'll provide some guidance there regarding how far you should go with identifying residents. Of course, maintain confidentiality, that's D. That was formerly in our bylaws. And another new one, present clearly the possible consequences if professional work is disregarded. So often we think of independence as differences between the public interest and private interest, opposing pressures. However, that's not true. You are the greatest value to your employer or your client when you're professionally independent. Anyone can tell them what they want to hear, but you will tell them what they need to know in order to be on side with their obligations, with the application of the science, and with the public interest. In BC, there is a lot of public land, public forest land. In that regard, it is a public interest statute that we're operating underneath. In fact, in appearance, not only be independent, but seen to be independent. There are expectations and pressures on individual professionals. Perception is important. All those elements exist, but the independent professional is able to rise above those and provide service to their employer or client in the interest of the public. So in our guidelines of interpretation, excuse me, in the guidelines for interpretation, we've drafted a definition of professional opinion. It's given by a professional who has the appropriate competencies and knowledge, skills, and ability to provide that opinion. It's supported by evidence. So, you know, data, assumptions, limitations, uncertainties, methodology, what have you used? It's documented in a manner that demonstrates diligence and it provides validation. So check out the guidelines for what is professional opinion. You need all those elements or else it's not a professional opinion. It's just an opinion. We have to develop guidelines around some of these things, how we identify the contributions of other work, like I mentioned, but also the possible consequences, how we would carry that out. You will see that show up in some of our guidance in the future. Conflict of interest, code standard 3. The conflict of interest is another one of those key requirements of the PGA. It was brought on early by some public issues and is one of the root causes, perhaps you could say, of Professional Governance Act. Having said that, though, you know, this whole movement in the PGA is worldwide. It's not just isolated to BC. It is a movement that you can see in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand. There is an ethical requirement, which is right here. And there's an independent statutory requirement on each registrant that exists. But like I said earlier, that statutory requirement, that declaration's not yet in effect. So registrants must avoid situations and circumstances in which there is a real or perceived conflict of interest. And they must. In the past, we were told in the Code of Ethics to refuse any assignment that creates a conflict of interest. That was a pretty high bar, and it was tough to regulate. So now we have the word avoid. Registrants must avoid. It's more in line with our direction that occurred. Did I know of the conflict when I took the assignment? That's hard to prove when it says the registrant must refuse. But avoid allows sometime conflict arises when I'm in the circumstance, but not in the beginning. So this PGA requirement changes the word from refuse to avoid and tells us how to deal with the circumstance. Disclose, mitigate, and ensure we don't bias our work. That last one about bias is new. It's a new take on how you can apply anything that you choose to resolve or mitigate the circumstance. You want to apply another lens to say, is it biasing my decisions? The business of forestry is expansive in that it covers the province. And in a way, it's also pretty small when you consider, many other professionals, the businesses, the agencies. It's not surprising to me that conflicts arise. It is what we do when that conflict arises that is the focus of the PGA requirement. A conflict exists when I have a task or responsibility to one party, like my employer, but I stand to personally benefit from a specific decision I make. That's a personal conflict. Also, a conflict can occur between parties. My professional work for one client to obtain, say, for example, a timber sale exists, while my colleague sitting right beside me is working for another client pursuing the same timber sale. Or even more stark example, I have two clients who I'm both working for, going for the same timber sale. I mean, those are obvious conflicts of interest. The professional system can't be undermined by having users of professional service, like employers or clients, and the public having a suspicion about the credibility of our work. We cannot neglect this concern. We have to act on it. This is why we identify the conflict, we disclose the conflict to the affected parties, we mitigate or resolve, and we demonstrate that it doesn't create bias. The fourth standard is the standard of due diligence. Much of the standard was already in place in the standards of professional practice. I put a new and different beside the laws and regulations, beside the standards, policies, and plans and practices of government or the ABCFP. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the scope is explicitly broader than the past. Even though the standard itself says registrants work with constant care and careful attention, it is a lot broader. And with respect to the standards, policies, plans, and government, or the ABCFP, notice the words have regard for. I'll come back to that in the next slide. And the ethical requirement is more explicit about knowing the fullness of your practice relative to the work that you do. And the last item that is new there, the common thread in the PGA and a common result in our peer-to-peer reviews, by the way, is our general lack of documentation. It's part of a culture of forestry, the just get her done approach, but it's also part of expedience, the situation that requires something written, but I really don't have the time to devote to it, or I don't want to draw attention to it. We need to put more effort and increase our vigilance in this area of due diligence. Forest professionals are accustomed to the words consider. Take the necessary steps to make sure an outcome is achieved and negative consequences do not occur. That's a basic statement of due diligence. In the past, we were always told to consider, and in fact, it shows up in other legislations that we work around. Now we have the words in the PGA that says to have regard for, referencing the structures of legislation to policies or plans. To have regard for is a higher standard than to consider. It means that you as a registrant take these laws, policies, plans into account in the course of your practice. What this means in detail and specific to various practice will be discussed later. I think we will be discussing this a lot more. At the minimum, I think I need to remain current in my practice. I need to understand the latitude that exists within a particular law or not, and I need to know the consequences of not following through. Those are things I'll have to be able to explain to my client or employer, and that I must know myself very, very well. For example, some laws or plans carry mandatory prescriptive language. In other words, an action can't be taken uh, unless you actually do the tasks. These are the results. Like a cutting authority, you must have that. A timber mark, you must have that. Here is a stocking standard you will use on these types of ecosystems. Some plant laws or plans are not mandatory or specific. There's more latitude, and you are given a set of targets, guidelines to use, to follow. Like cut control has a latitude. The way I prepare a site preparation prescription to undertake a certain number of plantable spots, that gives me some latitude. Due diligence is only effective if it is properly documented. Many of us have multiple mechanisms to demonstrate how we document, the procedures we follow, inspections completed. This is pretty common in large forest companies. They have really good checklists, standard operating procedures. As an independent forest professional, I might be more diligent around my practice diary. Maybe I will build some of my own SOPs. I have document retention planning. As a profession, we've not specifically identified professional documents, but you will see more from us, from the association regarding this in the future. Professional documents with specific requirements and requirements for professional work. So I've managed to cover the first code standards, give you a little bit of background, the competence, the ability to do a task or work, independence, objective, impartial, in fact, in appearance, the conflict of interest, identify, disclose, resolve, and document, and then our due diligence standard, take all the necessary steps. These are the foundation code standards. And next week, we'll have some office hours. Remember, that's May 26th, 1 hour, same time. This is a chance in the week following to ask questions, provide some comments if you want, directions you think we should go, ask, and we'll do our best to engage you and have the best answer to the questions. Depending on how much time those questions fill, you can send them in advance, but also I'll be prepared to cover a couple of other items of interest for you. Week 9 is bylaw 528, and June 16th is the second half of our code standards: integrity, forest stewardship, safety, professionalism, and reporting.
So Mike, we got a few more questions here. We got about 9 minutes. The first question, this is from an anonymous attendee. Regarding standard 1, competence, that one must meet competence expectations of your peers. Who are those peers? Can they include those who are not registrants?
Hey, that's a good question, Anonymous. I like the, yes, meet the expectation of our peers. I mean, in a general way, that meant that we're judged by a jury of our peers. I mean, if somebody says my practice was offside, a complaint goes to Casey, our registrar, the investigations committee takes hold. They're judging me against the standards that we've established and what other forest professionals are doing. So that's what we mean by expectation of our peers. But I pointed out that regulated practice could include activities from other regulators. And in that sense, does the professional work of those professions have a bearing on the word expectations? That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I think that's something we'll have to take back. And the fact that we have our superintending the regulated area of practice puts a new lens on this, and something I need to talk about, not only internally, but also with my colleagues in the agrology, biology, engineering, and ASTT.
Thanks, Mike. Another question from another anonymous attendee. So if the question is on public crown land and does not involve financial matters, would it be acceptable to call that confidential? I've seen this occur several times. For example, calling a VIA confidential, calling harvested beetle severity confidential. What is the line between confidential and legitimate info on crown land?
I think confidentiality refers to some of the legal mechanisms around what should be confidential. Obviously, personal information is confidential. You know, the sliding scale of confidentiality is tightly triggered to harm, I would say, and we need to be aware of the unexpected consequences of revealing information. On the other hand, there's balance between on Crown land, public land. What is it in terms of transparency that the public needs to know? What do they need to know? What should they know? What do you need to explain so that they know? I think there's a lot to write there. And again, it's something we're going to have to look at and look into. We're keeping track of these questions, by the way. So so we'll be able to dig into them some more.
Oh, great. Next question from Lori. Can professional provide advice / services for family woodlot if others know they are family? Or is any work for family a conflict of interest?
Yeah, you know, I've thought about, thanks, Lori. I've thought about that quite a bit, surprisingly enough, because, you know, we have a woodlot and I often think about, am I in conflict? and what do I need to do? Who are the affected parties? So remember, the PGA shifts it from of not having any assignment to avoid. So that means it's not necessarily that I shouldn't be in a conflict, but what I do after and recognize that I am in a conflict. So in my case, obviously, I practice for the profession, and I hire professional service to do that work. So I'm not particularly engaged. Now, it doesn't mean I'm not interested in the price of timber, absolutely, as an owner, but I don't practice that professional forestry. If in fact I choose one day to practice professional forestry on and be the owner of the woodlot, as many licensees are, then there is some necessary work that needs to be done so that others know that not only am I acting in the role of the forester protecting the public interest in the application of the practice of forestry, but also I'm the woodlot licensee and I have these set of obligations. And I would argue in some cases that is a stronger relationship for the government, because the same individual who's carrying out that practice is also the one carrying the contractual obligation under the Forest Act. But I'm sure there's a long discussion that we could have over that.
Another anonymous attendee asks, if I work for a private employer, am I expected to protect the public interest and protect the interests of my employer? Am I not in a conflict of interest anytime that the employer's goals are not in the best interests of the public?
It's I had the slide there and I talked about them. In my mind, they're aligned. You know, there are private interests, and there is a value in your employer knowing that you're providing the right professional service and that you are independent. There is a conflict perhaps that you know about, and so you need to be able to go to your employer. Remember that piece about expressing the consequences if professional judgment is not followed. So in some of those circumstances, what I've done in the past is to explain to my client or employer, here is the scope of what others do, other forest professionals do, and other tenure holders. Here is the choice you've asked me to do, and here's the consequences. So it puts them on a spectrum. They become a knowledgeable decision maker. There's no, and I document it so that there's evidence that they are. It's how I transact my job, and not necessarily where I place myself in the tension that exists between the contractual parties on the ground, being the government and a tenure holder.
Thanks, Mike. So we got 2 minutes left for a question from Greg about stewardship. Stewardship is most likely the reason we are here today, or perhaps of the apparent lack thereof. How do we change this cycle, diminishing stewardship as the forest resources become scarcer and change from external man-made pressures, including climate change? How do we hold firm as a professional organization to manage the landscape where we confidently say the forest is in good hands and in good health?
Yeah, I
There's a,
think this is, I mean, regardless of whether you're a forest professional or another professional operating in the environment, natural environment, you chose these careers, these professions because you enjoy that environment. There is an affinity that we share with the forest, with the natural environment in BC. And so it's hard to, we do get in these debates. I learned early on in my education in forestry that you really need to ask, there's one fundamental question you need to ask before you start, and that is, you ask the owner, sometimes it's the public, what is it you want from your forest? And that's what I work towards. My role in terms of making sure they're an informed decision maker, making sure that they understand the consequences of their choices. There will always be surprises like environmental issues like the mountain pine beetle, our challenges with climate change. And that's why you need professional service. At the end of the day, we do need objectives on the land, and we do need clear direction for forest professionals to achieve that.
Great. Thanks, Mike. It's 2:00. If you have any more questions about the code and how to apply it to your practice, Mike will be hosting the Zoom office hours next Wednesday, May 26th from 1 to 2 p.m. The office hours are an informal question and answer time where you can join, ask questions, or simply listen to the conversation. You can access the Zoom office hours by going to the ABCFP professional development offering pages, click on ABCFP courses, look up office hours with Mike for May 26th, and then register for the event. Please remember to add the event to your cart and only register for one event at a time. Thank you, and see you at the next webinar.